The rope whistled through the afternoon air and fell in a perfect loop around the fence post. And Josephine Whitmore felt something crack open inside her chest that she had locked away 2 years ago when they buried Thomas in the frozen ground back in Missouri. Her nephew Samuel, barely 9 years old with his father's dark hair and her sister's stubborn chin, whooped with delight and turned to the tall cowboy beside him, eyes shining with pure hero worship. The man, Quinn Xenon, reached down and ruffled the boy's hair with such natural affection that Josephine had to look away, her throat tightening unexpectedly. "Did you see that, Aunt Josie?" Samuel called across the dusty yard of her sister Margaret's ranch, waving the rope above his head like a trophy. "I got it on the first real try. I saw, sweetheart," she called back, managing to keep her voice steady despite the strange flutter in her chest. She had been watching for the better part of an hour as Quinn Xenon demonstrated the proper grip, the correct stance, the patient repetition of movement that transformed fumbling attempts into something approaching skill. She had watched the way he knelt in the Texas dust without concern for his trousers, the way he guided Samuel's small hands with his own larger ones, the way he praised effort as much as success. Margaret settled into the chair beside her on the porch, 2 glasses of cool water in her hands, and passed one to Josephine without a word. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as Quinn reset the rope and encouraged Samuel to try again. The July heat shimmered above the pastures that stretched toward the distant hills, and cicadas sang their relentless summer song in the cottonwoods that shaded the ranch house. "He is good with children," Josephine said quietly, more to herself than to her sister. Margaret made a small sound of agreement, then turned to look at Josephine with an expression that held equal parts fondness and exasperation. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout. "Marry that man." Josephine nearly dropped her water glass. "Margaret, I mean it." Her sister settled back in her chair, entirely unrepentant, her eyes still on the yard where Quinn was demonstrating the proper wrist motion again. "Look at him, Josie. He has been here 3 weeks helping John with the cattle and fixing fences, and not once has he shown anything but kindness. Samuel follows him like a shadow, and Quinn treats him like he matters. When was the last time someone looked at you the way he does when he thinks you are not paying attention?" Heat flooded Josephine's face that had nothing to do with the summer sun. "You are imagining things. I am not." Margaret's voice softened, losing its teasing edge. "You have been alone long enough, sister. Thomas would not want you to stop living." The name hung between them, heavy with memory and grief that had dulled but never quite disappeared. Josephine looked down at her hands, at the simple gold band she still wore, and felt the familiar war between loyalty to what was and the frightening possibility of what might be. "It does not matter what I might want," she said finally. "Quinn Xenon is a drifter. John said he hired him for the summer work, and come September he will be gone to wherever cowboys like him go next. You could ask him to stay." I could not possibly. Why not? Because asking meant risking, and risking meant the possibility of loss, and Josephine had lost enough. Because Quinn Xenon, with his easy smile and patient hands, represented something dangerous, something that might crack the careful control she had maintained since the fever took Thomas and left her a widow at 23. Because wanting something, someone, again terrified her more than loneliness ever could. She said none of this aloud. Instead, she rose from her chair and murmured something about helping with supper, escaping into the cool dimness of the house before Margaret could press further. That evening, they all gathered around Margaret and John's long dining table, the windows thrown open to catch any hint of breeze. Samuel chattered excitedly about his roping lesson between bites of roast chicken and potatoes, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to share every detail. John Patterson, Margaret's husband and a rancher born and bred in these Texas hills, listened with the fond tolerance of a man who genuinely loved his son. Margaret passed dishes and added her own observations, her eyes twinkling with mischief whenever they landed on Josephine. Quinn sat across from Josephine, his presence somehow both comfortable and unsettling. He had cleaned up for supper, his son's streaked brown hair still damp from washing, his shirt clean and pressed. When he spoke, his voice carried the easy drawl of someone raised in open spaces, and his words were thoughtful, measured, never rushed. "Samuel has good instincts," Quinn said when the boy finally paused for breath. "A lot of grown men never develop that feel for the rope. He listens, and he is willing to keep trying when it does not work the first time. Those are rare qualities." Samuel beamed, sitting up straighter in his chair. "Will you teach me more tomorrow?" Quinn hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, and something shadowed his expression before the easy smile returned. "If your father can spare me and the weather holds, I do not see why not." "The weather will hold," John said with the confidence of a man who had spent 40 years reading Texas skies. "We are in for a dry spell, I think. Good for getting the haying done, at least." The conversation shifted to ranch business, discussion of cattle prices and water levels, and the upcoming trip to San Antonio for supplies. Josephine found herself only half listening, her attention drawn again and again to Quinn, despite her best efforts. She noticed the way his hands moved when he talked, strong and capable, and marked with the scars of honest work. She noticed the laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, and the surprising gentleness in his expression when he looked at Samuel. She noticed, too, the moments when he seemed to drift, when his gaze would go distant and something troubled would cross his face before he pulled himself back to the present moment. After supper, Samuel begged to show his Aunt Josie the new foal born just a week before, and they all walked down to the barn in the cooling evening air. The foal was a gangly sorrel thing, all legs and curiosity, pressing its soft nose into Samuel's outstretched hand, while its mother looked on with patient tolerance. Quinn leaned against the stall door beside Josephine, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the evening air. "You are good with the boy," he said quietly. "He is easy to love." Josephine watched Samuel stroke the foal's neck with careful, gentle movements. "His father, my first husband Thomas's brother, died in a railroad accident 3 years ago. Margaret married John 2 years later, and John has been wonderful to Samuel, but I think the boy still misses having more family around." "Is that why you came? To give him more family?" "Partly." Josephine glanced at Quinn, found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "And partly because Margaret thought I needed to stop hiding in Missouri and remember how to live again." She had not meant to say that much, to reveal that much, but something about the quiet barn and the lowering sun and Quinn's steady presence loosened her tongue. "Sometimes hiding seems safer," Quinn said after a moment, and there was understanding in his voice that went deeper than simple sympathy. "Sometimes it is safer for a while, until you realize you are not really living at all anymore, just going through the motions." "Yes," Josephine whispered. "Exactly that." They stood in comfortable silence while Samuel talked to the foal in the solemn, serious tones children used with animals they considered friends. Finally, Margaret called that it was time to get the boy washed up and ready for bed, and the spell broke. Walking back to the house through the purple dusk, Josephine felt Quinn's presence beside her like a physical thing, an awareness that hummed along her skin and made her heart beat faster. She thought about what Margaret had whispered that afternoon, about the impossible suggestion that she might reach for happiness again, might risk her carefully guarded heart on a man who would be gone in 8 weeks. The summer took on a pattern after that, a rhythm that felt both comfortable and dangerous. Quinn worked the ranch alongside John, mending fences and moving cattle and breaking a young gelding to saddle with the same patience he showed Samuel. Most afternoons, if the work allowed, he spent an hour teaching the boy new tricks with the rope, progressing from simple loops to more complicated throws. Josephine found excuses to be nearby, shelling peas on the porch or hanging laundry or weeding Margaret's vegetable garden, always where she could watch without seeming to watch. She told herself it was concern for Samuel, a natural interest in her nephew's activities, but she knew she was lying to herself. It was Quinn she watched, Quinn whose movements she memorized, Quinn who filled her thoughts at night when she lay in the guest room and listened to the coyotes sing in the hills. Margaret, to her credit, stopped making pointed comments after that first day, but Josephine often caught her sister's knowing looks and had to resist the urge to flee back to Missouri, where life was safe and lonely and predictable. One afternoon in late July, a thunderstorm rolled in from the west with unexpected fury, sending everyone running for cover. Josephine had been in the garden when the first fat drops began to fall, and she gathered her basket and hurried toward the house, her skirts already dampening in the sudden downpour. She collided with Quinn on the porch steps, would have fallen if he had not caught her arms and steadied her. They stood frozen for a moment, rain streaming down around them, close enough that she could see the water droplets caught in his eyelashes and feel the rapid beat of her own pulse in her throat. "Are you all right?" His voice was rough, his hands still on her arms. "Yes." The word came out breathless. "Yes, I am fine." He released her slowly, as if reluctant, and they climbed the steps together. Inside, Margaret was already setting out towels and laughing about the speed of the storm. John came in from the barn with Samuel, both of them soaked and grinning, and the house filled with the comfortable chaos of wet clothes and shared stories. But Josephine could not stop thinking about the moment on the steps, about Quinn's hands on her arms, and the look in his eyes that had been something more than simple concern. That night, after Samuel was asleep and John had retired to his study to work on the ranch accounts, Josephine helped Margaret clean up the kitchen. Her sister was uncharacteristically quiet, and Josephine knew she was working up to saying something important. "He cares for you," Margaret said finally, scrubbing a pot with more force than necessary. "Quinn, I mean, anyone with eyes can see it." "Even if that were true," Josephine said carefully, "it would not change anything. He is leaving in September." "How do you know? Have you asked him his plans?" "John said he hired him for summer work. That does not mean he must leave when the work is done." Margaret set down the pot and turned to face Josephine directly. "Josie, I know you are scared. I know what Thomas's death did to you, how hard you had to fight just to keep breathing in those first months. But this is not living, tiptoeing around happiness because you are afraid it might be taken away. Everything might be taken away. That is life. The question is whether you are brave enough to reach for joy anyway." Tears pricked at Josephine's eyes. "What if I reach and he leaves anyway? What if I open my heart and he walks away? Then you will hurt, and you will heal because that is what we do, but at least you will have tried. At least you will not spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been if you had been brave enough to try." Josephine wiped at her eyes with the corner of her apron. "When did you become so wise?" "I have always been the wise sister," Margaret said with a return of her usual humor. "You were just too stubborn to notice." They finished the dishes in silence, but Josephine's mind would not quiet. She thought about what Margaret had said about bravery and reaching for joy and the cost of always playing it safe. She thought about Quinn's steady presence and gentle hands, and the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention. She thought about the fact that summer was racing past, that September would come whether she was ready or not, and that she might lose her chance entirely if she let fear make all her decisions. The next day dawned clear and hot, the storm having broken the humidity but brought no real relief from the summer heat. Quinn was in the corral after breakfast, working with the young gelding he had been training, and Josephine found herself drawn to the fence to watch. The horse was coming along beautifully, responding to Quinn's quiet commands and steady hand with increasing trust and confidence. Josephine knew nothing about breaking horses, but she recognized skill when she saw it, recognized the patience and empathy required to turn a wild creature into a willing partner. "He is good with animals, too," Samuel said, appearing at her elbow with his ever-present rope coiled in his hands. "Quinn says a horse knows if you are angry or scared or lying, so you have to be honest with them. You have to mean what you say." "That is good advice for more than just horses," Josephine said softly. Samuel nodded seriously, as if she had said something profound, then wandered off to practice his roping on a fence post. Josephine stayed at the fence, watching Quinn work, and tried to imagine being that honest, that brave, that willing to risk. At midday, when Quinn took a break to water the horse and himself, he walked over to where Josephine still stood. His shirt was damp with sweat, his face flushed from the heat and exertion, and she thought she had never seen anyone more attractive in her entire life. "You have been watching a long time," he said, but there was no accusation in his tone, only a gentle observation. "I find it interesting," Josephine said, which was true as far as it went. "The way you work with him, I mean. The horse." Quinn leaned against the fence beside her, close but not touching, his attention on the gelding cropping grass in the shade. "My father taught me. He always said you could tell everything you needed to know about a man by how he treated animals and children and women. People who could not defend themselves or fight back. He said power was a test, and most men failed it. Your father sounds like a good man. He was." Something sad crossed Quinn's face. "He died 5 years ago. Pneumonia took him one winter just like that. I was working a ranch up in Wyoming at the time, and by the time I got home to Kansas, he was already gone. I am sorry." Josephine knew the inadequacy of those words, knew how little they meant in the face of real grief, but she said them anyway because sometimes inadequate words were all anyone had to offer. "Thank you." Quinn was quiet for a moment, then continued in a voice that was carefully casual, as if the words did not matter much. "That was when I went into partnership with a man I thought was my friend. He talked a good game about building something lasting, about putting down roots and creating a legacy. Turned out he was better at talking than at honesty. He emptied our accounts and disappeared 6 months ago, left me holding debts I did not know we had and a reputation I did not earn." Josephine's chest tightened with sympathy and understanding. "That is why you are here. Why you are working summer jobs instead of running your own place." "That is why I am here," Quinn agreed. "I sold everything I could to pay off what he stole, and I have been moving since then, working where I can, saving what I can. I am planning to head to California in September. Fresh start, new territory. No one who knows the story of how Quinn Xenon got taken for a fool." So Margaret had been wrong. He did plan to leave, and he had good reason, and Josephine had been right to guard her heart because giving it to him would only mean watching him ride away in 8 weeks. "That sounds like a good plan," she managed, her voice only shaking a little. Quinn turned to look at her fully, and the expression in his eyes was complicated, conflicted, almost painful. It was a good plan. It felt like the right plan when I made it. Lately, though, I find myself questioning whether running to California is really starting fresh or just more hiding. Her breath caught. What do you mean? I mean that some places start to feel like home before you are ready for them to. I mean that some people make you think maybe putting down roots would not be so bad after all, even if you got burned before. I mean that walking away from Texas in September is starting to feel less like freedom and more like cowardice. They stared at each other, the July sun beating down and the world narrowed to just the two of them, and the words hanging in the hot air between them. Josephine's heart was racing, her hands trembling, everything in her screaming to be brave, to reach out, to risk. But fear was a powerful thing, and the words stuck in her throat. Aunt Josie. Samuel's voice shattered the moment, calling her to come see a trick he had finally mastered. Quinn stepped back, the spell broken, and Josephine fled toward her nephew on shaking legs. That night, she lay awake for hours, replaying the conversation, torturing herself with all the things she might have said, should have said, was too afraid to say. August arrived with no relief from the heat, and with it came a shift in the household that Josephine could not quite name but definitely felt. Quinn was quieter, more distant, though he still spent time with Samuel and still worked alongside John with the same dedication. But the easy warmth between him and Josephine had cooled, replaced by a careful politeness that hurt more than anger would have. She knew it was her fault. He had opened a door, had all but told her that he might stay if she gave him a reason to, and she had frozen, paralyzed by fear and old grief. Margaret, watching it all with increasing frustration, finally cornered Josephine in the garden one afternoon while Quinn was working far pastures with John. "You are letting him slip away," her sister said without preamble. "You are standing there watching happiness walk out the door because you are too scared to say 3 simple words." "What 3 words?" Josephine asked, though she knew perfectly well. "Do not leave," or "I care," or "Please stay." Take your pick, Josie. Any of them would work if you could just find the courage to say them. And if I say them and he leaves anyway, then you will know you tried and you will not spend the rest of your life regretting your silence. Margaret's voice gentled. "Sister, I understand your fear. I do. But I also know what I see when I watch the two of you together. He is falling in love with you, and you are falling in love with him, and the only thing standing in the way of your happiness is your unwillingness to be vulnerable again. Love is a strong word." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "It is also the right word. You love him, Josie. I see it in your face every time you look at him. The question is whether you love him enough to fight for him, to fight for yourself, before it is too late." Josephine wanted to argue, wanted to deny it, but the truth was too large to hide behind excuses anymore. She did love Quinn Xenon, loved his gentleness and strength, his patience with Samuel, his careful honesty, the way he made her feel alive for the first time in 2 years. She loved him, and she was terrified of that love, and Margaret was right that fear was about to cost her everything that mattered. "What if I am too late already?" she whispered. "Then you find out and you know, but I do not think you are. I think he is waiting, Josie. I think he is hoping you will give him a reason to tear up his California plans and stay right here." That evening, Josephine resolved to talk to Quinn, to find him alone and say the things that needed saying before courage failed her again. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. John came in from the far pastures with news that the cattle had broken through a fence line and scattered into the hill country, and that he and Quinn would need to spend the next few days rounding them up and repairing the damage. They left before dawn the next morning, taking supplies for several days, and leaving Margaret and Josephine to manage the ranch household and keep Samuel occupied. The boy was disappointed to lose his roping lessons, but Margaret kept him busy with chores and activities that filled the long, hot days. Josephine threw herself into helping, grateful for the physical labor that kept her mind from spinning endlessly through imagined conversations and possible futures. On the third day, a rider came with a message from John saying they had found most of the cattle but that repairs were taking longer than expected, and they would be gone at least 2 more days. Margaret read the note aloud over breakfast, then looked at Josephine with sympathy. "He will be back," she said quietly. "And when he is, you will tell him everything you should have said weeks ago." Josephine nodded, not trusting her voice, and went to help Samuel with his morning chores. But that afternoon, while Samuel was practicing his roping in the yard and Josephine was mending a shirt on the porch, the boy suddenly dropped his rope and turned toward the house with an expression of such desolation that Josephine's heart clenched. "Samuel, what is wrong, sweetheart?" "Quinn is leaving." The boy's voice cracked on the words. "In September, he is leaving and going to California, and I am never going to see him again." Josephine set down her mending and opened her arms, and Samuel crashed into her, holding on tight while his shoulders shook with tears he was trying manfully not to shed. "Did your mother tell you that?" Josephine asked gently, though she knew Margaret would not have said anything. "I heard her and Father talking last night. Father asked if Quinn had said anything about staying on after September, and Mother said she did not think so, that he had plans to go west. And I do not want him to go, Aunt Josie. I do not want him to leave." Josephine held her nephew close, her own eyes burning, and felt the weight of her cowardice settle on her shoulders. Samuel had already lost his father. He had attached himself to Quinn with all the fierce loyalty of a child hungry for male attention and affection. And now he was facing another loss, another abandonment, another hole in his young life. And it was within Josephine's power to stop it, or at least to try, if she could only find the words. "Samuel," she said carefully, "what if someone asked him to stay? What if someone told him that people here wanted him to stay, that he had a place here if he wanted it? Would that make a difference, do you think?" The boy pulled back to look at her with red-rimmed eyes. "Would you ask him? Would you tell him we want him to stay?" "I am asking if you think it would matter," Josephine said, her heart pounding. "If he cares about California more than he cares about Texas, then asking might not change anything." Samuel scrubbed at his eyes with his sleeve. "He told me once that home was not a place, it was people. He said his father taught him that. So maybe if the right people asked, if the right people told him that this was home, maybe he would stay." Out of the mouths of children, Josephine thought, came wisdom that adults spent lifetimes learning. She hugged Samuel again, pressing a kiss to the top of his head, and made a decision. "When Quinn comes back," she said firmly, "we will tell him together. We will tell him that we want him to stay, that he has a home here if he wants it, and then it will be up to him to decide." "Promise?" Samuel asked, his voice small and hopeful. "I promise," Josephine said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. John and Quinn returned 2 days later, tired and dust-covered and smelling of cattle and hard work. Margaret fussed over John, ushering him toward a bath and hot food, while Samuel launched himself at Quinn with all the enthusiasm of a puppy greeting its favorite person. Quinn caught the boy with a laugh, swinging him up briefly before setting him down. "Miss me, did you?" "Yes," Samuel said with utter seriousness. "I need to talk to you about something important, when you are cleaned up and not so smelly." Quinn raised an eyebrow, looking past Samuel to where Josephine stood on the porch, her heart in her throat. Their eyes met, held, and she saw the question there, the uncertainty, the flicker of hope that he was trying hard to suppress. "All right," Quinn said slowly. "Important conversation when I am less dusty. I can manage that." He disappeared to the bunkhouse to clean up, and Samuel paced the porch like a caged cat, nervous energy radiating from every movement. Josephine tried to calm him, tried to calm herself, but her hands were shaking and her mouth was dry. Margaret appeared at her elbow, pressed a glass of cool water into her hand, and whispered, "Be brave, sister. Be brave for both of you." Quinn returned an hour later, clean and changed, his hair still damp and his expression carefully neutral. Samuel grabbed his hand and tugged him toward the barn, casting a look back at Josephine that was equal parts plea and command. She followed, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Inside the barn, in the cool dimness that smelled of hay and horses, Samuel took a deep breath and looked up at Quinn with all the fierce determination of a child who had decided on a course of action and would not be swayed. "I do not want you to go to California," he said, words tumbling out in a rush. "I want you to stay here. You could work for Father, or you could get your own place nearby, or you could do anything you wanted, but you would be here. You would not be gone forever where I could not see you. Please, Quinn, please stay." The cowboy's face went through a complicated series of emotions, shock and pain and something that looked like longing, before settling into a carefully gentle expression. He knelt down so he was eye level with Samuel, his hands on the boy's shoulders. "Samuel, I am honored that you would want me to stay, more honored than I can say, but I have plans, commitments, reasons for going to California that do not have anything to do with how much I care about you or your family." "What reasons?" Samuel demanded. "What could be in California that is better than being here? A fresh start," Quinn said quietly. "A place where I can build something new without the past hanging over me." "That is stupid," Samuel said, tears starting to track down his face again. "You could build something new here. You could build anything you wanted here, unless you do not want to, unless we do not matter enough." "You matter," Quinn said, his voice rough with emotion. "You matter more than you know, Samuel. Then stay." The boy was crying openly now, all his 9-year-old hope and hurt laid bare. "Please, Quinn, please stay." Josephine could not bear it any longer. She stepped forward, her own vision blurred with tears, and found her voice at last. "I am asking too," she said, and her voice was shaking but clear. "I am asking you to stay, Quinn Xenon. Not just for Samuel, though he needs you and loves you, but for me. Because I have been hiding for 2 years and you made me remember how to live again. Because I watch you with Samuel and I see the kind of man worth taking a chance on. Because I am terrified and probably making a fool of myself, but Margaret said I would regret my silence more than I would regret my honesty. And she was right." She stopped, took a breath, made herself meet his eyes even though she felt stripped bare and vulnerable in a way that was almost painful. "I am asking you to stay because I have fallen in love with you," she said, the words coming easier now that they had started. "I did not mean to. I did not want to. I fought it with everything I had because I was so afraid of being hurt again, of losing someone else I loved. But I love you anyway, and I am asking you to stay, and if you still go to California in September, then at least I will know I was brave enough to try." The silence that followed was enormous, broken only by Samuel's hitching breaths and the stamp of horses in their stalls. Quinn was staring at her with an expression she could not read, his face gone pale beneath his tan, his hands fallen to his sides. Then, moving slowly as if in a dream, he stood and crossed the space between them, and his hands came up to frame her face with such tenderness that she gasped. "Josephine," he said, and her name on his lips was a prayer and a promise. "I have been planning to leave because I thought there was no reason to stay. I thought I was just another hired hand, here for a season and then gone. I thought you were untouchable, unreachable, still wrapped in grief for your husband and uninterested in anything I might offer. I thought staying would only mean watching you from a distance and wanting something I could never have. You thought wrong, she whispered. I am seeing that. His thumb brushed across her cheek, catching a tear she had not known she shed. I have been in love with you since the first week I was here. I have been fighting it just as hard as you have, telling myself it was temporary, that I would leave and forget and move on. But I do not want to leave, Josephine. I do not want to forget. I want to stay right here and build something real with you if you will have me. Yes, she breathed. Yes, I will have you. Yes to all of it. He kissed her then, soft and careful and full of promises, and Josephine felt the last of her fear crack and fall away. When they broke apart, Samuel was grinning through his tears, and the future opened up before them bright and full of possibility. That night, over supper, Quinn officially asked John if he could stay on permanently, maybe buy some land nearby and start his own small ranch while continuing to help with the larger operation. John, who had seen this coming from miles away according to Margaret, agreed immediately and offered to help Quinn find a good parcel at a fair price. Margaret cried happy tears and hugged Josephine so hard she squeaked, whispering, "I told you so," in a tone of profound satisfaction. Samuel glowed with pleasure, already making plans for all the things Quinn could teach him, all the adventures they would have. And Josephine, sitting beside Quinn with his hand warm in hers, felt something she had not felt in 2 years. She felt hope, bright and strong and real, and she felt the stirrings of joy that she had thought were lost to her forever. The next weeks passed in a blur of happiness and planning. Quinn found a parcel of land just 2 miles from John and Margaret's ranch, 100 acres with good water and better views, and he put down money to buy it with the savings he had been hoarding for California. John helped him draw up plans for a house, something modest but sturdy, big enough for a family if things went the way Quinn hoped they would. Josephine spent her days in a haze of contentment, helping Margaret with the household work, but stealing every possible moment to be with Quinn. They walked the boundaries of his new land together, talking about where the house should go, where the corrals and barn should be built, how many cattle he might run to start. They sat on the porch in the evenings and talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and hopes and dreams. Samuel was their constant shadow, and neither of them minded. The boy had appointed himself assistant in all of Quinn's projects, and Quinn treated his help with the same seriousness he would have given an adult partner. In late August, on an evening when the heat finally broke and a cool breeze blew down from the hills, Quinn asked Josephine to marry him. There was no grand gesture, no elaborate plan. They were walking back from seeing the foundation that had been laid for his house, and he simply stopped in the middle of the path, took both her hands in his, and asked if she would be his wife. She said yes before he finished the question. They were married in early September in the small church in Las Animas, with Margaret crying happily, and Samuel serving as a very serious ring bearer, and John beaming like he had personally arranged the whole thing. Josephine wore her mother's lace, altered to fit her by Margaret's skilled hands, and Quinn wore a new suit that made him look uncomfortable but devastatingly handsome. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Quinn kissed her with such gentle passion that the small congregation broke into spontaneous applause, and Josephine felt her heart might actually burst with happiness. They moved into Quinn's new house in October, the structure finished enough to be livable, though work would continue for months to add all the details Quinn had planned. It was strange and wonderful to wake up in her own home, in her own bed, with her own husband beside her. Strange and wonderful to cook in her own kitchen and hang curtains in her own windows and plant a garden in her own yard. Samuel visited constantly, often staying overnight and helping Quinn with the ranch work. Josephine loved watching them together, loved seeing the bond between them grow deeper and stronger. Quinn was patient and kind and pushed Samuel to try new things, and the boy flourished under his attention. In the spring, Josephine discovered she was expecting their first child. Quinn's joy was almost comical in its intensity, and he immediately became absurdly protective, trying to wrap her in cotton wool and forbid her from doing any work at all. She laughed at him and kissed him and told him she was pregnant, not made of glass, and that she intended to live her life normally until such time as the baby made that impossible. Their daughter was born in November, just over a year after Josephine first watched Quinn teach Samuel to rope, a healthy, squalling baby with her father's nose and her mother's stubborn chin. They named her Natalie Josephine Xenon, and Quinn cried when he held her for the first time, this big, tough cowboy reduced to tears by 7 pounds of infant. Samuel was fascinated by his new cousin, declaring himself her official protector and taking his duties with utmost seriousness. 2 years later, when Natalie was toddling around the ranch getting into everything, Josephine gave birth to their second child, a son they named William Thomas Xenon after Quinn's father and Josephine's first husband. Quinn had suggested the name, wanting to honor the man who had loved Josephine first and made her the woman Quinn fell in love with. And Josephine loved him all the more for the generosity of that gesture. William was a calm baby where Natalie had been fussy, content to watch the world with solemn dark eyes and smile at whoever happened to pass by. Samuel, now a teenager, still visited often and helped Quinn run the ranch that had grown and prospered beyond their early hopes. The years rolled on, marked by the seasons and the work and the small, perfect moments that made a life. Josephine's hair gained threads of silver, and Quinn's face gained more lines, and neither of them minded because they earned those marks together. Samuel grew into a fine young man, as skilled with a rope as his teacher, and as kind-hearted as his mother. He eventually married a girl from Los Animas, a rancher's daughter with a quick laugh and a good head for cattle, and they settled on land adjacent to Quinn's ranch, continuing the tradition of family and partnership. Margaret and John remained their closest friends and neighbors, and the two households functioned almost as one, sharing holidays and hardships and the everyday joys of living. Margaret took great pleasure in reminding Josephine, at least once a year, that she had been right about Quinn from the very beginning. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Quinn and Josephine rode out to the place where he had first started teaching Samuel to rope, the dusty yard of John and Margaret's ranch that had been the beginning of everything. They sat on the porch rail, hands linked, and watched Natalie and William playing with Samuel's children, the next generation learning their own lessons about ropes and horses and family. "You ever regret it?" Josephine asked quietly. "Giving up California, staying here when you had planned to go?" Quinn turned to look at her, his eyes warm with love that had only deepened over the decade they had shared. "Not for a single second. California was a plan, a place I was running toward because I did not think I had anything worth staying for, but you gave me a reason to stay. You and Samuel and this place, you gave me a home. You gave me everything that matters. You gave me my life back," Josephine said, squeezing his hand. "You reminded me that grief does not have to be forever, that it is possible to love again after loss. You made me brave." "We made each other brave," Quinn corrected gently. "That is what love does, I think. It gives you courage to risk, to hope, to try for happiness even when you are terrified." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play. And Josephine thought about that day 10 years ago when she had watched this man teach her nephew to rope, and her sister had whispered that impossible, perfect suggestion. She thought about how close she had come to letting fear win, to letting Quinn walk away because she was too scared to reach for what she wanted. She thought about all the moments since then, the 1,000 small joys and the handful of sorrows, the way their lives had woven together into something stronger than either of them could have built alone. She thought about the home they had made, the children they had raised, the love they had nurtured through seasons and years. And she was grateful, deeply and profoundly grateful, that she had found the courage to ask him to stay. That night, as they rode back to their own ranch in the cooling evening air, Natalie chattering about everything she had done that day and William dozing against Quinn's chest, Josephine felt a contentment so complete it was almost overwhelming. This was what she had thought she lost forever when Thomas died. This sense of belonging, of being loved and loving in return, of building something that would outlast them both. She had been wrong to think she could never have it again. She had been wrong to let fear make her decisions. And she was endlessly, eternally grateful that Quinn had been patient enough to wait for her to find her courage, and that Samuel had been brave enough to ask what she had been too afraid to say. The ranch prospered over the years, growing from a modest operation into something impressive. Quinn had a gift for breeding cattle and an eye for good stock, and word spread. Buyers came from as far as San Antonio and even from Dallas, willing to pay premium prices for his animals. He hired hands to help with the work, good men who stayed season after season, because Quinn treated them fairly and paid them well. Josephine turned her own talents to the practical side of ranching, keeping books and managing accounts with a skill that surprised even her. Together, she and Quinn built something that was more than just a successful business. They built a legacy, something they could pass down to their children and their children's children. Natalie grew into a spirited young woman with her father's love of horses and her mother's quick mind. She could rope nearly as well as Samuel by the time she was 12, and she had opinions on every aspect of running the ranch that she shared freely, whether asked or not. Quinn delighted in her, never once suggesting that ranching was not suitable work for a girl, and Josephine loved him all the more for raising their daughter to believe she could do anything she set her mind to. William was quieter, more contemplative, but no less capable. He had his father's patience and his mother's eye for detail, and he approached every task with a thoroughness that would serve him well throughout his life. He loved the land itself, loved learning about water and grass and soil, and Quinn encouraged that interest, teaching him everything he knew about stewardship and sustainability. When Josephine was 38 and Quinn 42, they faced the first real crisis of their marriage. A drought struck Texas that summer, the worst anyone could remember, and the water levels dropped dangerously low. Cattle died, wells ran dry, and ranchers all over the hill country faced the possibility of complete ruin. Quinn worked himself to exhaustion, hauling water and moving what cattle he could to better grazing, trying desperately to save the herd he had spent 15 years building. Josephine stood beside him, equally exhausted, managing the books and making impossible decisions about what they could afford to do and what they simply could not. There were nights when they fell into bed too tired to speak, nights when Josephine watched Quinn sleep and saw the weight of worry aging him before her eyes. There were mornings when she wanted nothing more than to give up, to sell everything and move somewhere easier, somewhere that did not demand so much. But they did not give up. They worked and they prayed, and they accepted help from neighbors who were fighting the same battle. Samuel brought water for their cattle from a spring on his land that was holding better than most. Margaret and John sent food and hands to help with the work. The community that Quinn and Josephine had invested in for 15 years invested back, and together they survived what they could not have survived alone. When the rains finally came in September, breaking the drought in spectacular fashion, Josephine stood in the downpour and cried with relief and exhaustion and gratitude. Quinn found her there, soaked to the skin and weeping, and he pulled her close and held her while the rain washed away months of dust and fear. "We made it," he said against her hair. "We made it, Josie." "We did," she agreed, and knew she was not just talking about the drought. They had made it through the crisis with their marriage intact, with their love stronger for having weathered something terrible together. That was worth celebrating. The ranch recovered slowly but surely. It took 2 years to rebuild the herd to its former size, 2 years of careful management and hard work and calculated risk. But they did it, and when they stood on the other side of those hard years, Josephine and Quinn both knew they could survive anything life threw at them. Time, which had seemed so slow in the early years of their marriage, began to move faster. Natalie turned 18, then 20, then 22. She married a young rancher from a neighboring county, a man Quinn thoroughly investigated and approved of, and they settled nearby. Within a year, she presented Josephine and Quinn with their first grandchild, a grandson they all doted on shamelessly. William followed a different path. He went to agricultural college in College Station, learning the newest methods of land management and animal husbandry, and returned home full of ideas for improving the ranch. Quinn listened to all of them, implemented most of them, and took pride in watching his son bring modern knowledge to traditional ranching. Samuel, still their closest friend despite the decades that had passed, became a grandfather himself, and the circle continued. His children were teaching their children to rope, just as he had been taught, and the tradition passed down through the generations. On a cool evening in October, 28 years after that first afternoon when she had watched a cowboy teach her nephew to rope, Josephine sat on her own porch with Quinn beside her, their hands linked the way they always were, and watched the sun set over the hills they had made their home. They were both in their 50s now, their children grown and starting families of their own, their life's work largely accomplished. The ranch was thriving, their family was healthy and happy, and the love between them had only deepened with time. "You remember the day we met?" Quinn asked, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. "Of course," Josephine said. "I watched you teach Samuel to rope. Margaret leaned over and told me to marry you. Wise woman, your sister. She has her moments." Josephine smiled, squeezing his hand. "Did you know then?" "That day, did you have any idea we would end up here?" Quinn considered the question, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "I knew you were beautiful. I knew you were sad. I knew I wanted to make you smile. As for the rest, no, I had no idea. I thought I was just passing through, teaching a boy to rope, and then moving on. I had no idea I was meeting the woman who would become my whole world." Josephine turned to kiss him, this man who had saved her from grief and given her back her life, this man who had been patient and kind and steadfast through nearly 3 decades of marriage. She kissed him with all the love she had carried for him since that summer day when he had knelt in the dust beside her nephew and shown her what gentleness looked like. "I love you," she said when they parted. "I have loved you for 28 years, and I will love you for however many years we have left." "I love you too," Quinn said. "Always have, always will." They sat together as the stars came out, talking quietly about small things and important things and everything in between. and Josephine thought about how different her life might have been if she had let fear win. If she had stayed silent, if she had let Quinn leave for California, if she had chosen safety over risk and loneliness over love. But she had been brave. Samuel had been brave. Together, they had asked Quinn to stay, and he had chosen them, chosen this place, chosen the life they had built together. It was the best decision any of them had ever made. Years continued to pass, each one marked by the familiar rhythms of ranch life and family gatherings. Josephine and Quinn grew older together, their bodies slowing but their love never diminishing. They became great-grandparents, watching with pride as their legacy spread through the generations. The ranch they had built continued to thrive under William's management, and Natalie's children showed the same gift with horses that had marked both their mother and grandfather. Margaret passed peacefully in her sleep at 78, with John following her less than a year later, and Josephine mourned the sister who had been her champion and her friend. But she did not mourn alone. Quinn stood beside her through the grief, steady and strong, just as he had stood beside her through every joy and sorrow of their shared life. Samuel lived to see his 82nd birthday, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of whom could rope, because he had learned from the best and passed that knowledge down. When he died, Quinn and Josephine stood graveside and remembered the boy who had brought them together, the boy whose innocent plea had changed all their lives. On their 40th wedding anniversary, Quinn and Josephine gathered their entire family at the ranch for a celebration. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren filled the house and yard, 3 generations of family that existed because a frightened widow had found the courage to love again, and a betrayed cowboy had found the courage to stay. They ate and danced and told stories, and when the sun began to set, Quinn stood and raised his glass to toast his wife. His hand shook slightly with age, and his voice was not as strong as it once had been, but his words rang clear. 40 years ago, he said, I was planning to run away to California because I thought I had nothing worth staying for. Then I met a woman who made me remember what home felt like, and a boy who reminded me what mattered, and a family who showed me what love looked like. I stayed, and it was the best decision I ever made. Here is to Josephine, who made me brave enough to try again. Here is to family, which is everything. Here is to home, which is not a place but people. Here is to love, which saves us all. The family raised their glasses and cheered, and Josephine cried happy tears while her grandchildren hugged her, and her children beamed with pride. That night, after everyone had gone home or gone to bed, Josephine and Quinn sat together in the parlor of the house they had built 40 years before. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light over familiar furnishings and beloved mementos, and Josephine felt a deep, abiding sense of peace. We did well, Quinn said softly. You and I, we did well. We did, Josephine agreed. We built something beautiful. We did, Quinn said. Something that will last long after we are gone. Our children will remember, and their children will remember, and the story of how we found each other will be told around these fires for generations. Josephine leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, and thought about that story. She thought about a frightened widow and a betrayed cowboy, about a boy who needed a father figure and a sister who knew love when she saw it. She thought about the courage it took to risk after loss, to stay after betrayal, to reach for happiness when fear screamed to play it safe. She thought about rope tricks in a dusty yard and whispered advice on a summer porch, about conversations in a barn and promises made in a church, about droughts survived and children raised and love that deepened with every passing year. It was a good story. It was a true story. It was their story, and Josephine would not change a single word of it. They sat together by the fire, two old people who had loved each other through 4 decades of joy and sorrow, of success and struggle, of ordinary days and extraordinary moments. They sat together, hands linked the way they always were, and counted themselves blessed beyond measure. Outside, the Texas stars shone down on the ranch they had built, the home they had made, the legacy they would leave. Inside, the fire burned warm and the house creaked with comfortable familiarity, and two people who had found each other against all odds rested in the perfect peace of a love that had stood the test of time. Josephine Whitmore Xenon had watched a cowboy teach her nephew to rope on a hot July afternoon in 1882, and her sister had whispered that she should marry him. She had been terrified and resistant and certain she could never love again. But Margaret had been right, as sisters sometimes are. Quinn Xenon was exactly the man she should marry, and she had found the courage to tell him so before it was too late. Everything good in her life for the past 40 years flowed from that moment of bravery, from that choice to risk her heart one more time. It had been worth it. Every moment of fear, every instance of uncertainty, every second of vulnerability had been worth it for the life they had built together. As the fire burned down to embers and the house settled into nighttime quiet, Josephine and Quinn climbed the stairs to the bedroom they had shared for 40 years. They moved slowly, bodies aged but spirits still young, still in love, still grateful for every day they had together. They fell asleep the way they always did, wrapped in each other's arms, two hearts beating in comfortable synchrony, two lives so thoroughly entwined that neither could imagine existence without the other. And in the morning, they would wake to another day in the life they had chosen, another day in the home they had built, another day of the love story that had begun with a rope trick and a whispered suggestion and the courage to ask a good man to stay. It was enough. It was everything. It was a lifetime of love, and neither of them would have changed a single moment of the journey that had brought them here.